Hey, welcome again to the Be a Maker Club podcast. Today we have another maker with us who does some really exciting things. His name is Jeff Harris. He lives in San Dimas and he works on ultralight backpacking. He has an Etsy shop, and I'm going to let him tell us all about it. Welcome, Jeff. Welcome to the Be a Maker Club podcast. So tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us a little bit about what you make.
So I just started this little venture. I want to say like last winter. So it's very limited at the moment, but I do have some plans. And currently, what I'm doing is to elevate my skills to achieve those plans. So right now, I've got about 5 products on my store. Fairly simple, mostly like storage items, like stuff sacks. I have a roll top dry bag, a patch kit. Um, a sack for holding your tent stakes, and then a packing cube, basically, that fits really nicely into like a standard size backpack for backpacking. Um, Ultimate goals, though, for this store is to build an ultralight tent that is freestanding. Most of the ultralight tents that you'll see on the market are non-freestanding or semi-freestanding, which is completely understandable because most ultralight backpackers are looking to save as much. I mean, they're counting grams, right? They're not looking at it with how many ounces it weighs. They want to know how many grams it weighs, and they'll do anything to shave one or two. But I still believe that there is a market for what I'm looking at based on my own personal needs, right? I don't really want to deal with setting up a semi-freestanding or non-freestanding tent after a full day of hiking. I'm prepared to sacrifice a few ounces or grams, and if you want to look at it that way, to have an easier setup. And I've done a lot of research into it. I used to work at REI for a little while, and I would ask customers about it, and then also my coworkers about it. And it seems that there's a need for this, but there's not really one out there yet. So I'm looking to build a freestanding ultralight tent, a 2-person tent that comes in under 2 pounds. My goal is a pound and a half.
Okay.
Um, but and then another goal that I have for my store is jackets. I don't know why or where this came from, but I have this weird obsession with jackets.
Okay.
I own more jackets than the average person should. And if I really like a jacket, it's pretty common that I'll buy 2 of the same one, just different colors. So I'd really like to make a few different styles of jacket and then also get to tent making. And then I think along the way, other things will come along. Other ideas have popped into my head, like a sling bag, over one shoulder type of bag that's ultralight. And that would be more for like um, so I think the people that are ultralight backpackers or are interested in it, they kind of carry that into their regular life, right? It's almost like it becomes an identity of sorts.
Right.
So when they're walking around Pasadena, shopping one day, it looks kind of cool if they have like an everyday carry that's also a ultralight item, or at least made with the same materials
Gotcha.
that their gear is made out of.
So I'm going to ask you for a little more clarification here because I'm making the assumption based just on the words. Ultralight means it's super light. But
Yep.
tell us a little more about the background of this because I know during this story I heard a couple of things like people who are hiking and they're obviously carrying everything. So paint a sort of if you like a larger scale picture so our listeners can understand. Like who are these types of people who are typically looking for ultralight, and why is this even a category?
Oh,
I mean,
well, that's a really difficult question to answer with extreme accuracy, but I have an idea of it, right? I'm 44 years old. I've been backpacking for about 15, 16 years now. But I've always been an outdoor enthusiast. And I can remember when I was younger, everything was about heavy duty, how long it lasts. This is tougher than that, right? You didn't want a ultralight backpack because let's face it, to get lightweight gear, you have to use lightweight fabrics, and lightweight fabrics tend not to be durable or sturdy, right? And they came a long way with that. I can go a little bit into that in just a second, but I think originally, what I can remember from childhood and like my father being into some things like that, where most backpacking gear came from was the army, right?
right, right.
They were like the survival experts, right? So all of that stuff was built to last, right? You didn't want to send a guy into battle with something that was going to tear on the first day, and now he's stuck with that for the remainder of his tour of duty. So I think that's kind of where all of that stuff started. You had mountaineering that started in I don't even know when it started, but late 1800s, early 1900s. Seems like early 1900s is when it got big. People were climbing Everest and things like that. And mountaineering definitely has a different requirement from gear than just the average backpacker would want. So I think originally you had all this heavy gear, and then somewhere along the way, somebody decided, hey, this stuff weighs too much, right? Why am I carrying 50 pounds on my back when I could be carrying 30?
Right.
And then even why am I carrying 30 when I can carry 20, right? So at some point, the main fabric that I'm using currently it's called Dyneema, and that's the brand of this fabric. It's actually the fabric is made from fibers that are ultra high molecular weight polyethylene. And I don't really understand all of what that means other
Okay.
than you got ultra high molecular weight. So there's something they're doing something with this polyethylene to make it really strong. And if people don't know out there, we use synthetic winch ropes now, right, on a winch for a four-wheel drive truck, or even on a winch for, a moving a vehicle that like tows other vehicles or something like that, right? You can use these synthetic ropes instead of having a steel cable. And again, I don't really know where this all started. I would imagine in some industry somewhere, like shipping yards use it. They have like inch and a half diameter ropes that they use to like moor the boats to the thing. Well, inch and a half diameter rope that's made out of some organic material is pretty damn heavy. But if you can make it much lighter by using this new
I go.
fiber, then that's better, right? It's easier for the workers and whatnot. So Dyneema is a fabric that I believe started out in sailing, right? So
Okay.
and I don't think large sailboats. I think it's more of a competitive, smaller sailboat thing, right? So single person racers, maybe even small crew
Mhm.
boats, right? That are like 20 to 40 feet, somewhere in there. They might be using them as well. But what they do is they take a sheet of mylar, then they weave this polyethylene, this ultra high molecular weight polyethylene, and then they laminate that with another sheet of mylar. So it's essentially two sheets of
Wow.
mylar and then weaved um, ultra high molecular weight polyethylene in between. And
That's actually a mouthful to say. I congratulations on saying it correctly every single time.
yeah, it is. It's you. They make an acronym out of it. It's just I have a harder time saying the acronym, which is weird. I don't know why. But yeah, so they came up with this fabric, right? And most lightweight fabrics for outdoor use were either uh, polyethylene or nylon.
Mhm.
And those tend to, like, if you're getting down to the lightest one, you can get down to about zero point 0.8 ounces per square yard. Where Dyneema, I haven't actually used it, but I've seen it down to 0.3 ounce per square
Wow.
yard. The lightest I use is 0.5.
Okay.
Uh, and so that's a significant weight saving if you're doing
Yeah.
like a tent, right? You've got probably 6 to 10 square yards of fabric that you're doing if you have like an inner tent and a shell tent, an outer shell to it as well. So you can save quite a bit of weight there in terms of backpacking, right? You can cut your gear down pretty light that way. But anyway, this fabric started, I believe, as a sailing fabric, and people just started incorporating it into their backpacking gear. It has an excellent, tear resistance, right? You can't really pull it and stretch it in either direction very well. I mean, it can be done, obviously, but not as easily as like a nylon.
Right.
The only weakness that it has is the same weakness that every fabric has, is that you can poke holes in it, right? So I mean, there's
Yeah, it's
it,
not. It's not.
until
Yeah.
yeah, until and I don't ever see that going away, right? That would take a very uh um a high-end fabric to be
Yeah.
able to be that lightweight but also keep from having punctures. But anyway, so that's how it all started, and I think it was just backpackers at home tinkering with things. A large company that people might, if they're into backpacking, have heard of is Hyperlight Mountain Gear, and that's really the one that I saw first. Right, that's the largest company out there that I've seen. They have their own website, they do their own stuff. They don't even, sew their stuff in house anymore. It's all done in factories now at this point.
Wow.
So I think it just started in someone's garage and then it turned into an industry. And then, humans are interesting creatures, right? They always want the next best thing, and
Right.
we're always searching for, ooh, what's next, right? We're looking for that. So if you find yourself in a hobby, you typically don't stay at the bottom of that hobby, right? You go as far as your finances will allow, typically, right? Some people I imagine have more self-control, but I'm not one of those guys. uh, so I think that that's how it started. I think that that's where people got it from, and now it's like if you talk to like a real ultralight backpacker, right? I don't consider myself a real ultralight backpacker. I'm kind of half in between. But if you talk to a real ultralight backpacker, they are always looking for the next way to cut a few grams off of their gear weight, right? And it could be cutting their toothbrush in half and just a,
Oh,
a number of things. Yeah. Oh yeah,
no,
you'd be
okay, okay.
surprised.
So I'd be yeah. So I'd be interested in you kind of maybe defining this more. Like, what is then an ultralight backpacker? Like, how do you define that person compared to like? Because you said you're not. So
Yeah,
what's
yeah.
the
So
line? So
let's put it on a spectrum, right?
okay,
On one end of the spectrum, we have someone who wants the heaviest duty, longest lasting, toughest gear on the market, right? And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have the ultralight backpacker, right? So we'll call this the ultra heavy backpacker and this the
okay,
ultralight backpacker.
okay, okay,
And I don't really think anybody is on this end of the spectrum, the
right,
ultra
right.
heavy, right? Almost everybody is trying to have I think the vast majority of people are trying to have a balance of lightweight but durable gear, right? Because not all of us have a disposable income. Not all of us are making our own gear, right? So there's a trade-off, and most people I think sit somewhere in the center of that spectrum where they see something. Let's say they're searching for a tent, right? That's an easy one to go with. So they're like, okay, I need a two-person tent, right? That's where they start. I need two people to fit in it. Okay, well now what do you want? Do you want it to be freestanding? Do you want it to be a trekking pole tent where you use your trekking poles and to set it up? Like how do you want to go on that route? And then they'll choose that, right? So let's say they choose, okay, I want freestanding, right? I want the ease of being able to just put some poles in it, clip the tent to the poles and be done, right? I don't want to mess with any other stuff because the trekking pole tents, you got to select your campsite a little bit more with a little more care because you need to have space because now you got trekking poles holding it up. But in order to get those trekking poles not to fall down, it's a lot like a giant circus tent, right? You got to tie it down to different
Mhm.
points on the ground, so your footprint ends up being much larger. And with a tent like that, where with a freestanding tent, you've got poles. I would be a person that would say you should still be tying that tent down as well. But most people don't, in my experience. Walking around campgrounds, I see people with their freestanding tents and there's no guidelines on it or anything like that. And I get it, I've done it before. Um, so then you have that aspect. And then I think what plays in next for most people is budget, right? Like what of the desirable traits that I need, what am I able to afford?
Mhm.
There's a tent manufacturer out there called Big Agnes, and they have a pretty broad range of inexpensive, uh, uh, you know, I'm going to use this once a year tent, and then real expensive, made with some Dyneema fabric. I'm looking for the lightest tent I can find. So the heavy ones, we're looking at for like a two-person, 5 to 6 pounds. And the ultralight ones, 2 pounds and maybe even a little bit less than that, right? Just shy of 2 pounds. Like let's say a couple ounces less than that would be my
Just to put
guess.
that in context, what would be the weight of everything that the person would carry? Like if they were an ultralight backpacker or like somewhere in the middle, because we're discounting the sort of what we call the ultra heavy backpacker, right? So
Yeah, yeah. 'Cause I
so
don't really think ultra heavy now would be someone who's into mountaineering and they're choosing their gear based on survival, right? You're
right,
gonna climb Mount Everest. That's the most
yeah,
dangerous
yeah,
place
yeah.
to be in the world. So you're choosing stuff based
No,
on survival, not on weight. So we'll
not
we'll
on
just
weight,
leave that
right.
person out of the conversation. But someone in the middle, if we're not counting food and water, because that's all going to change depending on the duration of your trip. If we're not counting food and water, I would say you're looking between 20 to 30 pounds in your
Okay.
gear, depending on what your budget is able to afford you. And then if you're ultralight and you've got an endless budget, you could probably push that weight down to 10 to 15 pounds.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So
Sure.
and all too it depends. The average backpacker is going to carry a lot more stuff than the seasoned veteran, right? The
Yeah,
seasoned
of
veteran
course. Of
already
course.
knows what he or she needs uh,
Minimal.
to handle their trip, right? So, and they're not going to carry anything that's in excess of that. Whereas the occasional backpacker is like, oh man, I'm going to take
Yeah, I
this
might need this.
insulated bag and a couple of beers inside this insulated bag. So when I get to my camp, I have something to sip on. You know, they're going to carry heavier foods most likely and
Mhm.
more of it, is in my experience. Uh, they may want something like a towel so that they can take a shower
Oh,
or
yeah.
to take a bath in a river close by, where an ultralight backpacker would use like a hand cloth as a towel, right? Or maybe even just like a pair of shorts that they had, or
Mhm. Mhm.
they would improvise, or maybe just air dry. Like
Yeah.
an ultralight backpacker has a mindset of what do I what is the least amount of stuff I can carry at the least amount of weight that I can carry it at. So I think maybe, some of them could even get below 10 pounds.
Wow.
I can
Wow.
remember one trip I did in the Olympic National Park in Washington, and I would say it was 5 days for me, and I probably had about 45 pounds on my back, counting food and all the other stuff. And this was kind of earlier in my experience, so I was one of those people carrying things I didn't need,
Right.
and also I was kind of trying things out, right? So that's part of the game.
Mm.
But I remember I was real deep into the trail there, and this guy comes walking by me, and he had like what looked like the size of like a JanSport kid's school backpack, right? And he has the shortest shorts, a tank top shirt, and that's it. And I'm like, how is this guy going to survive back here? But he was
Worth it.
probably a much more seasoned veteran than I, and he had it whittled down to the very minimum of what he needed. And also, when you think about it too, if you're carrying 40 pounds on your back, the distance that you can walk in a day is shortened by that extra weight.
Oh,
Versus if you're carrying 10 or 15 pounds on your back,
right.
now it's like just walking with nothing, right? And any of us can walk 5 to 10 miles with if we're relatively healthy on a given day, if we're just walking around a town or at Disneyland or wherever. But some of these guys will walk 20 to 30 miles in a day,
Yeah.
so based on that.
So I mean that actually. So I mean that I'm glad you mentioned that because my mind was mostly going towards comfort and stuff. But yeah, this is also a component of it because what would take a more regular person like maybe 2 to 3 days, ultralight backpacker who's experienced might actually even do it in a day,
Yeah,
right? So it
yeah.
completely changes then what you can see, how much and how long your breaks and stuff could be.
Yeah, and then you've got athletes like ultra marathon runners, right? These people
Right,
can
right.
run 50 or 60 miles. Well, if they
Wow.
can run 50 or 60 miles in one go at it, well, they can walk that easily,
Yeah.
right? That's
Yeah.
nothing for them. So you got to like most ultralight people are also some type of like high endurance athlete, or somebody. They either have a lot of money to invest in their gear and they're out to get the next best thing, or
Mhm.
this is their passion and they have no problem walking 20 to 30 miles in a day with a steep incline in their hike. So it's really it is a spectrum, but it is a pretty broad spectrum, a pretty or long spectrum of people, and lots of different things play into the role of that. But you mentioned comfort, and that's sort of my thing, right? That's kind of why if you could put me on the spectrum, I would be in between the middle and the ultralight, because I'm 44 years old. I want comfort. I do this for enjoyment. I don't have anything to prove to anyone, not even myself, really, at that matter, right? I'm not trying to conquer any goals.
Right,
Um,
right.
I just go out for fun and because I enjoy being outdoors. And that's why I say I fall
No, no,
somewhere in
okay. Yeah,
between.
no, that makes sense. I mean, especially when you're talking about weight reduction and both even the camping side, I mean, this is clearly new territory. I mean, I wasn't even aware of a lot of this. So I cycle, I used to road bike, so I understand the,
Yeah,
shaping of the grams. But then when we do camping, like I go with my kids, right? And we're typically that, or we stuff the car, right?
yeah,
We take like, oh, take this as a backup and then take that as a backup to the backup
yeah,
type of
yeah.
thing, right? Because again, we have the car, and so it's a very different way of thinking. I mean, of course, I'm not physically carrying everything, but still I recognize how much stuff we take, and then when we come back, we realize, "Ah, I didn't use like a lot of that. It's
Yeah.
just like it was just complete waste. It occupied space. But okay, let me get into a little bit slightly different territory here. I also feel that maybe sometimes there's people who actually enjoy the prep side or on planning of it. They're like, oh, I'm gonna take this thing because I'm gonna do this, and they actually, whether they execute on that activity or not, they actually like, like, oh, I'm gonna take this telescope with me. I'm gonna take this kind of binocular. I'm gonna take 5 different lenses, or I'm gonna wear this jacket, and then it has 3 layers. So I'm gonna take out the first layer because when it's gonna be so they have this imaginary at times situations, and so then they get all the gear to go with that. So have you so I'm saying, how does that fit into maybe the story? Are these mostly all amateurs, or are there people who just love doing that even though they know that they might not use it? I'm just trying to get a sense of like the psychology of
I would say both. I
okay.
would say a little bit of both, right? I think as an amateur, you're thinking less about um all these cool things I want to do. And you're thinking more about, I might need this and I might need that.
Okay.
And oh, what if I need this, right? And then as you progress in your passion, then you realize, well, I bought this dry bag that hangs and it's black and you hang it in the sun and it heats up and then you open it has a valve on the bottom and you can use it like a shower. I bought this pocket shower to bring with me on my trip, but this isn't really it's cool. It's funner to sit in the river and use the cold river water to take some. Now you stop taking that, right?
Right,
So I,
right.
I think as you progress, you go through situations like that where you're like, oh, I bought this big stove, but I only really need one burner, so I'm going to go to a smaller stove to save space in my car if you're a car camper. Um, I lived in Washington for a little bit and I did some sea kayaking and similar, right? When I would sea kayak out to in the San Juan Islands and go to an island to camp overnight, man, I would load fresh steak in my boat
Oh wow.
because, the water up there never really gets above 55, 56 degrees. So you just put the food down in the bottom and you've got that cool water.
Right, right.
And a steak, realistically, like if we're being honest, it could last a day in room temperature and you can still eat it as long as the steak is fresh. But I would take steak and asparagus and stuff a cast iron grill, a griddle thing in there, and I
Wow.
could build a fire under my cast iron griddle and cook my steaks and my asparagus. I would bring beer because the boat carried it all, right? I didn't have to worry about it. And as long as I didn't exceed the weight limit of the boat, then I was good to go. Um, so I think a lot of times amateurs start out as like, oh, I might need this, right? They're thinking in preparation of the worst, which is a lot of times what humans do, right? Like, oh, what if this happens? And then as you get more experience, then you're doing the latter part, the one you said, where it's like you're like, oh, what I'd really like to do is, watch for shooting stars. So I'm going to bring these binoculars, or I'd like to. Um, I don't know, have a particular fire, so I'm going to bring this particular fire starting stuff or whatever, So I think as it goes, you drift towards that second choice of these are the things I'd like to do while I'm out there, and whether or not they come to fruition is a whole nother story because maybe you're tired, maybe there's nothing around to have your fire, um, or maybe it's unsafe. Maybe you get to your camp location and you're like, well, there's too much stuff here that could catch on fire easily, so I have to go
Yeah,
away from
there's
that
something
plan.
new.
So I think a little bit of both, but as a beginner, you definitely start out with that, like, I might need this.
So let's switch tracks a little bit. I want to ask you more about like your skills in actually making this stuff. Like, how do you come up with? I guess we're now I think fairly clear on your inspiration, right?
Mhm.
But how do you? What's your process like once you've had the idea? How do you turn it into an actual, I guess, design? And then, how? Tell us a little bit about your background in terms of the skills that you picked up. Do you always have the making skills? Are you learning them? How, just give me a sense of the manufacturing side of this and the design side of it.
Okay. So as far as the products I have, essentially what I'm doing is making things that are staples in the backpacking
Okay.
industry, right? So something as simple as a stuff sack, right? Just a small bag to organize your stuff, right? Okay. All my clothes are going to go in this one, and all my fire starting stuff's gonna, and maybe like so for me, like what I do, I get clothes in one. I have one bag that is like I call my like survival kit, right? It's got a few things that I can repair my gear with, a few things that I could use to start a fire if I needed one. Most often in the backcountry, you're not, that's a lot of work, right? Collecting wood and collecting enough. If you've ever had a fire out in the wilderness, you know that the wood goes fast. So there's a lot of work involved in that, and it's more of a luxury than it is anything else. Um, so I have like that little kit. I have a first aid kit, right? So these different bags are your way of organizing things. And typically a stuff sack has just got a drawstring at the top. So it's not, even if it's made with a waterproof fabric, it could still get water inside it. So I also have a roll top, like dry bag, like quote unquote dry bag that I make. So like let's say you've got something and you think maybe there might be rain on your trip, or maybe you've got some river crossings to do. So you want a little bit of insurance that maybe your sleeping bag's not going to get wet, right? That's pretty
Right.
important to have that thing be dry, and your extra gear, or maybe you take electronics with you. You're a
Mhm.
photographer and you take a little bit of extra stuff, right? A battery that an external battery pack that you take with you, and extra cards, memory cards and things like that for your photography. You would want to keep your electronics dry, so you might want to use that in a dry bag. Um, I also have a stake sack, which is essentially just a stuff sack where I've reinforced the bottom so that the stakes can't poke through it as
Okay.
easily. It's designed to fit the common stakes that are available on the market today. Um, I have a packing cube, which is essentially just another way of organizing your gear. But the cool thing about the packing cubes, if you're like the Tetris packer, right? If you want to try to fit the most stuff in the most organized fashion, the cube is just a square that could drop right into your semi-cylindrical backpack, and then you can just stack them on top of each other, and then you can put in order of, well, you want your heavy things closest to your back, right? You want the things you're going to use most, or reach into your pack to grab most, close to the top somewhere if they're not abnormally heavy, which they wouldn't be. So you can pack your backpack up a little bit better that way. And the packing cube is just a rectangle with a zipper that comes around it. And these are all items that you can buy from other manufacturers, right? So as far as like coming up with the design, I didn't really come up with the idea, but then I designed my own. I use SketchUp as a
Mhm.
way to draw it and
Okay.
and make sure that my measurements are right. So like with the roll top bag, it has an oval bottom. So in
Okay.
order to get my size right for the fabric that goes around it, I decide what size oval bottom I want, and then I create a seam allowance. And then with SketchUp, I can measure how long that line is. And now I know exactly how long I need my top piece to be. So when I sew it all together, it matches up perfectly, right? So it's a useful tool in that regard. Um, and then outside of that, it's mostly just, like what you're thinking of. So like right now, one of the things I mentioned earlier was I want to build a jacket. So I
Yeah.
bought a pattern for a jacket, just online. I found a pattern for an anorak style jacket. And I'm going to start with that pattern. I'm going to make that jacket and then look at it. And I have my own ideas of what I really want. And they're based off the 10 or 15 jackets that I own.
Mhm.
And each jacket has something about it that I like particularly. Like one jacket has a hood that I think is the most amazing hood ever put on a jacket. Um, in terms of a like a rain type jacket. And then I have an insulating jacket that also has a hood that I think is the most amazing insulating a hood on an insulating jacket. So I'm taking all these different ideas, the way the cuffs work, whether or not it's going to have a zipper. There's a multitude of pieces of gear that I'm using to come up with my own idea to incorporate the things that I want and get rid of the things that I didn't like about whatever particular jacket. So that's going to be a long process, I think, for me, because I don't want to put something out that's just generic. I want it to be mine, and I want it to um, fill the gaps in the market that I currently see.
Mhm.
Um,
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And tell me about your actual manufacturing skills. Like, how did you learn
So
to?
this is weird. Well, I take that back. I guess I'm gonna dig a little deep into my youth here for this one. I grew up poor, in a rough house, right? I had a father who was abusive. Um, so for the most part, I didn't even want to be home. I wanted to take off. I wanted to be in the backyard, when I was real little. And then by the time I was big enough where I could hop on a bike and leave the house without my parents freaking out, I was gone, right? I didn't really want to be there. And I also didn't really have money. So if I wanted something, I had to find a way to either get it on my own or make it.
Okay, yeah.
Um, One of the things I got into when I was young, I was like, I don't know, 10 or so, I started rock climbing. But
Oh,
rock climbing is an expensive sport, right? And I had a friend who did it, and he had the full family, right? His parents got along, so there was money that he had. So he was able to buy things that are shareable, right? So like if you go with two people, you really only need one rope, right?
okay.
Um, you really only need like one set of like anchors and things like that. If you're doing like a top rope, right, you're just going to anchor it once and you're both going to use the same thing. But each person needs a harness. Each
Mm.
person needs their shoes. So
Yeah.
things like that, right? Well, I couldn't afford a harness. And my mom had this old Singer sewing machine where like the top flipped open and the sewing machine flipped out of it. And it had a belt drive. It was probably from the 40s or 50s. Um, and I found webbing. I don't know where. Must have been in my garage, must have been my dad's at some point. But I found webbing and I made my own harness, which I'm sure when people see this, they're going to be like, "Oh my God, that's so dangerous." But I was 10. I weighed like 60 pounds, right? Like, and also, does a 10-year-old think of that? You know,
Yeah, that's
Not
not the
really,
first.
right?
That's not the first thing that's going through your mind. Yeah.
Yeah, and if you think about it, that harness that you paid $100 for, made by Petzl at REI, somebody sewed that too,
Right. Right.
right?
Of course.
And
Of
and
course.
I studied my friend's harness
Uh-huh.
and feel like I did a good job. And man, I took a bunch of falls. I wasn't doing any lead climbing, which is a whole nother thing where your falls are a lot greater or a lot further distance, and then there's a lot more impact force, right?
Right. Right.
That's where the
Burn the
force of
harder.
it. Yeah, you're really stressing your harness and your gear with that type of climbing. I just did top roping, where the maximum distance you're coming down is a few feet, and looking back on it now, yeah, was it like unsafe? I guess in some regard, but like I say, like I weighed like 60 pounds, and I'm very confident. I've always been very confident in my abilities to make stuff. I've made bows and arrows. I like, actually made the bow from pieces of wood out that I found, out in the wilderness.
Wow. Okay.
You weren't going to take down a prize deer with it, but me and my cousins used to shoot target practice with it all the time and have a good time with
Wow.
it. So I've always been real confident in my ability to make things and also reverse engineer things.
Mm.
If I see something I like and I can't afford it, then I want to study it, and if possible, then to see if I can make it, right?
Right.
And
Right.
I can reverse engineer most things as long as I have the resources and tools available to do it. So the harness, I had the webbing,
You have everything. Yeah.
yeah, I had the
You got
sewing
a reference
machine.
idea. A
Yeah,
reference
I
product.
studied
You
the
know
way they
exactly how
stitched
to
it.
use it.
Yeah, well, I didn't. I had my mom show me, how do
Oh
I
no,
use
no, I
this?
meant the harness. Like you
Oh,
knew
yeah,
what
yeah,
the
yeah.
usage of it was. So you kind of had all the right bits there for you to
Yeah.
execute.
Yeah, so that was my first ever experience sewing, right? Young, and she helped me. She at least helped show me how to use the machine, and then I copied the harness. And like there's like they use like a box stitch with an X in between it, right? And that's a real strong stitch. So I copied that style stitch and everything. But that was my first experience sewing. And then throughout my life, I've always fixed things that would, clothing would rip a seam and I would stitch it up, or I don't know, I needed to modify a backpack or something, I would stitch it up, but I mostly did it by hand at that point. And then fast forward to 2020, COVID hits. I had a job in manufacturing at the time. Our plant got shut down. So I'm sitting at home and I'm like, man, what could I do? And my sister had just passed away in November of 2019. So there was a lot of like, I had to keep myself busy, right? Like I was going through this grieving process and that was very difficult. So I just sitting around not working was eating away at me. So they're on the news talking about hospitals need masks, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, shit, I can do anything. I'm gonna go buy a sewing machine and I'm gonna start making masks for hospitals. So that's what I did. I went and bought a sewing machine. I taught myself how to make a mask, and then I hopped online to see what local hospitals still needed masks. And by the time I had got to the point where I was able to make the mask, nobody needed them anymore. So, I thought it was kind of funny, but also at least I had this new skill, right? I
Of
could
course.
sew. So I started using the sewing machine I had to like fix things. I had pants that were torn and whatever, and I went down that road. And then, I was living in Washington at the time that this happened. And when things kind of settled, I moved back home. I was like 21, 2021. And I looked for work. And a place that I always enjoyed going to was REI. So I got a job
Okay.
there part-time. And when I started working there, I think my exposure to customers, the questions they had, the concerns they had, the ideas that they had, like, why doesn't this tent have this? And I'm like, well, you're asking the wrong person, but this is my best guess at
Mhm.
that response
Mhm.
to that. Um, I started thinking, man, I kind of want to make my own thing,
Right.
and it took a while before I finally pulled the trigger. I mentioned earlier the company Hyperlight Mountain Gear. I bought a few of their things to kind of see how they're using this fabric and how they're making it. I hopped online and read about it, and then I ordered some fabric and just started doing it.
Yeah.
And opened up the Etsy store, and here we are about 4 or 5 months later.
Nice. Well, I want to make a couple of comments. So my background, I've taught design entrepreneurship. I was a professor at university. And so we went through kind of what I call an academic process. And then, of course, at the children's makerspace. So, we taught kids how to think of ideas and then turn them into design and then manufacture them. With that background, one of the things that you said I thought was very, very interesting was you used the word reverse engineering. And I tell you, in formal education, reverse engineering is so undervalued, but I think it's such a phenomenal way to learn something because and that's this just the skill part for the making, but also from a business point of view, it's such a great idea because it just makes sense, right? Like if there's a product that works but has a gap in a feature or a texture or something, um, it saves you so much work, right? You don't have to come up with the research behind why should this product exist. You can just take a product, learn how it's made, and then add a feature on top. And so I've always had such a problem with how reverse engineering is kind of looked down upon in formal education. But here you are, you're talking through, how you've come up with the idea, how you made things work, and I think it's very undervalued basically. So sorry, you touched upon something that I also pet peeve about. So I just wanted to commend you on that and just highlighting because I think there are also people that I've talked to who kind of feel that oh, it's bad to reverse it. Like they feel like they're copying something, and they're not. It's not creative, which I think is complete nonsense, really, because um, there's literally nothing we're doing that isn't copied, right? Like I
Yeah,
mean,
at this point, everything's built upon.
yes, yes, and so it's not just a I'd say it's not just a legitimate way of innovation, but it's the most natural way of innovating, right? For things that I don't know anything about, once I buy and use a product, and that's the only time I'll start to discover how limited it is. And if if it's someone like yourself who actually has the skills, or is always made, you'll be always like, okay, let me add this stuff to this and make it better, right? So yeah, sorry, I just wanted to commend you on
Oh,
that
yeah.
because I like it. I'm so pleased to hear that you're being upfront and saying that because a lot of people think, oh, no, I shouldn't be talking about this. So it's well done. And
I
I
think there's just
appreciate
like
you really saying it nice and clear.
I think there's a little bit of a stigma around it, right? And
Of course.
without getting too deep into it, I think it stems from big business, right? We got patents and all these things, right? And you know it 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 even has an element of greed to it, right? That's mine, right? That's my idea. That's my design. Well, yeah, you're right. That there is something as intellectual property, and there's a reason why we have patents and things like that. Um, but something simple, right? Like uh I'm trying to think like something extravagant that might. like when the iPhone first came out, right? I imagine that there was some type of patent on parts of the design of it, but it didn't take long before someone came out with something similar to it, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean that they took that phone and stole the designs of all the different chips and the motherboard and all of that stuff that went into it. It just means that someone took that basic idea and said, "Hey, I'm going to create my own similar product, but it's going to be completely different, right? And you're not going to be able to tie the two together, and it's not going to violate patents." Um, I think people think of it almost as like theft, right? Which where there's
Mhm.
total stigma around, but the reality is something like a shovel, right? That's a very generic product, and we've got different types of shovels, right? There's narrow ones for digging trenches if you're doing irrigation for a landscaping crew. There's the plain old spade shovel if you're just digging holes. There's the flat nose shovel if you're trying to shovel material off of a flat surface into a wheelbarrow. And if you come up with a way like, oh man, this handle hurts my hands, I'm going to break this handle off and design this more ergonomic handle. Well, did you really steal the person's idea,
Yeah.
or did you just make it a little bit better and more safe or more comfortable to use, right? You didn't take the idea from them, and that's definitely not something I've ever done. And when I was talking about my jackets, like I really want the jacket to be mine, right? I don't want to just um, take my favorite jacket and copy it, right? Measure out all the different uh, measurements on it, and then just copy it and call
Not
that
just
jacket mine.
duplicate it. You want
Yeah,
like you
yeah,
want
that's that to
and
me would be
yeah,
theft, and that
yeah. And
that
I just
that
want to
is
be clear. I was not advocating
yeah,
that. What I was trying to say is, yeah, that I recognize, right? If you invested a large amount of resources in innovation and bring something truly unique to the market, you should be able to take advantage of it, commercial advantage. But yeah, and I think that's sort of that I was trying to get to the mentality of how people like really think and very much like, oh, I can't, I have to completely come with something brand new. And
well,
that's what I was trying to say. I think as a process, that's not really possible. That's what I mean.
yeah, and
Even with highly technical things, right? It's not completely brand new in that respect. There's a huge amount of innovation. Like you could take a leap forward, but there's still a baseline from where you've started.
yeah, and like if you want to get real technical about it, we're none of us are really having novel ideas anymore, right? We're having ideas that start from some baseline, and then we're adding something novel to it. if if reverse engineering is something bad or theft, then we're all stealing. Like no computer could exist without the mathematic geniuses from hundreds of years ago, right? We would computers and cell phones and all that stuff, it's based on math. So essentially, did you steal that math? No, it just is. You just learned it. So reverse engineering to me really is an excellent way to learn something. It's how we learn
Yeah,
everything,
totally.
right? You learn all about Pythagorean theorem by reverse engineering it.
Yes, yes. And
So
and,
so
and especially for physical world products, it's a great way.
yeah.
But this also brings me very nicely to sort of the last question I really want to ask is, why do you want to make? I mean, I got some from your story, but if I'd ask you, like, say, answer maybe one line and then expand upon it, like, why do you like to make?
So
What does it
I
do for you personally?
personally, ah man, I think it's like an outlet for me, right? I mentioned my childhood being rough and not really being able to afford things, right? So I had to find a way to make it. But also there was like this like intrigue, right? Like I can remember being young. Um, I mean, I don't even know how old, but let's definitely between 5 and 10 years old. And my sister and I were living here in Southern California, and we were born in Fresno. So we have family up there, and it was summer. Every summer we would go up there and stay with our family for a few weeks or whatever. And we went up there, and we're staying with my aunt and my uncle, who also have a son and a daughter. And I don't know if my cousin was sick, my cousin Jordan, their son, was sick or what, but for whatever reason, the my sister and my cousin Jessica, they had some other girls over, and my aunt was teaching them origami.
Mhm.
They were, folding up things. And for whatever reason, I was kind of by myself. And I didn't want to invade the girls' little party, right? They're over there having their own little party doing girl things. But I was curious about what they were doing.
Uh-huh.
So at one point they got up and went outside or stepped away from the table, and I walked over and I grabbed one of the things that they had made, right? A swan or something. I don't really remember exactly. And I unfolded the swan, and then I got a piece of paper and I folded my own,
Oh,
right? Like,
wow.
yeah, so th there's always this like intrigue to me, like of how things work, right? Is how are they doing that? Like how does this function or whatever? And one way or another, I've always found like, okay, if this interests me, I want to make it.
Mm.
Um, so there was both that aspect of not being able to afford certain things, so I had to make them, but also seeing things and being intrigued by them and going, how does that work? I have to know how it works, right? I would take apart radios, and I had an uncle who was a appliance repairman, right? He would fix TVs and VCRs way back when those were a thing, and I just loved going to his shop, right, and learning about electronics and why do you use that resistor and what's the point of this and asking all these questions because I was just curious about it. I watched. I remember it was Robin Hood, the Prince of Thieves, the one with Kevin Costner in
Uh-huh.
it, and I was like, man, that's so cool. They made their own bows and arrows. So I don't know if you remember, but back in the 80s, there were like book clubs and like cassette clubs, right? You could join this club and they would have a whole list of books that you could order from, and you paid whatever, whatever the monthly thing was, and you got X amount of books for that month. And I found in there like secrets of Native Americans and how the Native Americans made bows. Like I had like three books that I found on it. So
Uh-huh.
I bought these books and I read and I read and I read, and mo most of it was too much, right? Like they wanted you to find a log and then let it season for a year and
Oh,
then use all this heavy machine equipment to cut it down and do all this stuff. And I'm like, well, I can't do that, right? Like I don't have a year to wait. I need this now. And so I took these ideas that they showed, which again to me, like as I'm reading the book, I'm like, the Native Americans didn't do that. They didn't have a sawmill. They might have let the wood sit around and season, or maybe they just found seasoned wood. But you know, I dug deeper into it, and I'd go to the library. We didn't have the internet back then, so you couldn't just look it up on Google. So I'd go to the library and find a book, that would talk more about it. And eventually, I was able to make my own bows, And I didn't make the string like out of animal sinew, like their tendons, and there's just things that this little kid couldn't do, right? So I found other ways to do it.
uh-huh.
Um, you know, uh, Trying to think of other things that I did. I played guitar, and I found a book on how to make your own effects pedals for the guitar, right? So I would make my own. I would go to Radio Shack and buy all the components, and I would take a pedal that you would go to Guitar Center and pay $50 to $60 for, and I would make one for 5 or 6.
Right.
You and obviously the
Was
quality
it,
is not.
I know, but was there a sense of gratification as well, I
Oh
imagine?
yeah. There's
I mean,
always a
once you
sense
got
of
the
like I
meme,
did it,
yeah,
huh?
I guess that's the part, like, because when you have the necessity, like, then you can see the story why you're doing it, right? But once you have the resources, why do you do it?
I've done all this stuff for so long that it's just become a part of who I am, right? I became a mechanic. I
Oh,
worked on airplanes and heavy equipment. Um, and through all of that, the funnest part for me wasn't actually turning wrenches, but fabrication, right? Oh, this part's broken, Jeff. We need it fixed, but we can't buy one. Can you fix this for us?
oh, wow.
Yes, right? Or making my own custom tools. I had this job for a little while in heavy equipment where it was most heavy equipment mechanics, they got a truck and they go out into the field and they fix the equipment. Well, at this job I just worked in a shop.
Okay.
And so if the field mechanic couldn't fix it, then they brought the tractor in and
Uh-huh.
it sat in the yard because you needed more things, right? You needed a different type of welder, you needed to wait for parts, you needed to buy or make a part, right? And I got to the point where I was making so many tools for this company that I would use the welder to weld in a serial number on it. And I called it JH Tools, right? Jeff Harris Tools.
Oh, wow.
I would weld JH tools, and then I would put number and 00001, 00002, and
Wow.
I had a whole shelf of these like custom tools that I made, and I don't know. I always had pride in that, right? Like I made something that we needed, and we didn't have to wait for it, but we also didn't have to pay $1,200 for something that I was able to make for two.
Right.
You know, so that was also another thing for me, right? Because again, money was always a thing, so it became like a goal to like, ooh, can I do this, right? Um, and then as I started really getting into outdoor gear, that was when I started noticing like, oh man, this is a great product, but I wish it had blah, 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 right? And sometimes I would add things to my existing products. Um, but at that point in my life, I was making good money, so I didn't really have to make things, and I kind of drifted away from it at a point. And then when I started working at REI was when I started thinking like, man, this could be something not only to satisfy my creative thirst, but something to build upon, maybe my own business, my own brand, right?
Yeah.
Um, so that's kind of how I drifted into that, right? Started as a kid, just intrigued, interested in, someone would tell me you can't, and I would be like, watch me.
Oh yeah, that's I can see how that would be a great trigger incentive. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, Jeff, thank you so much. I
Yeah.
really, really appreciate sharing your story, your motivations. It's so much fun to always talk to a maker, trying to unravel how they're thinking. Thank you very much for
Yeah.
being a guest on our show.
And thanks for having me.